And now it's time to go to our next session on the geopolitical convergence on Venezuela. We have another extraordinary panel joining us at this time. And let me introduce the moderator of the next panel, Dr. Eduardo Gamarra, a good friend and colleague at FIU. Eduardo is a tenured full professor of political science in the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU. He has been at FIU since 1986, and from 1994 to 2007, he was a director of the Latin American and Caribbean Center, the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, one of the venues that co-sponsored this conference. So, dear Eduardo, the floor is yours, and much success in this final panel for the morning.
Thank you so much, President Solis. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to moderate this panel and really to participate in what up until now has been really an extraordinary gathering. I will, as moderator, take back the 4 minutes that the previous panel took from us. So we will try to be on time. So the topic of this panel is of course one that is really today and on everyone's minds, the geopolitical convergence in Venezuela. Venezuela, as most of us know, has been a major concern in the region for at least the past 23 years, or since the election of Hugo Chavez to office. Concern over the last 2 decades has really centered on the nature, the quality, and of course now on the backsliding of democracy and policy. And policy, in my view, has largely been driven by this overarching concern. We might argue that the sanctions regime that we've imposed on Venezuela have been driven first and foremost by the desire and the need to restore a regime that respects human rights and liberal democratic principles. However, those concerns appear to be taking a back seat given what is now really a stark new international reality following the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. In that context, one might even argue that Venezuela is at the epicenter of geopolitical convergence, at least in our hemisphere. As most of us know and teach, right? Venezuela is home to the world's largest oil reserves, and really for the better part of the 20th century, Venezuela was a very strong ally of the United States with multiple businesses, cultural, and certainly diplomatic ties. Today, however, Venezuela has become what we might call de-Westernized through an increasing influence by let's call them anti-democratic, certainly anti-liberal democratic countries, by countries that are outrightly anti-American, and of course a very close relationship even with Vladimir Putin. And these have, in a sense, colluded to create what some analysts are calling alternate economies, pardon me. These alternate economies have very opaque trading practices, unclear money flows, a complex web of shell companies, money laundering schemes around the globe. And clearly here, Maduro, the president of Venezuela, skirts all international sanctions and imposes anti-democratic policies and of course deepens his grip on Venezuela in a dictatorial manner. Well, to analyze this complex situation in Venezuela and in the region, we've convoked a superb group of analysts and experts. Allow me to introduce them very briefly. I will then ask each to provide us with a 3 to 5 minute introduction, and we will then proceed to a more interactive session of questions and answers. So we're joined today by Celina Realullo, professor of practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Studies. We're also joined by David Vogt, the managing director of IPD Latin America. Michael Penfold, who is at the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración in Venezuela. And finally, by somebody you all know and care for, Brian Fonseca, who's the director of the Jack B. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. So let me begin then in the order in which I've introduced you. Let me ask Professor Realuyo to give us 3 to 5 minutes of an introductory remark, sort of reacting to this idea of convergence in the region.
First, thanks so much to my colleagues at FIU. It's wonderful to see you all, at least virtually, sometime soon, hopefully in person. But I've been looking at this concept of convergence for many years. Here at National Defense University in 2013, we actually published a book looking at the convergence of illicit networks. And obviously, we've seen Venezuela as a great example of this convergence of illicit networks. And now more globally in terms of geopolitics, which is the topic of our session. And it's been for many years, perhaps the battlefield or the battleground of democracy versus autocracy, right? In terms of the rise of Chavez and Maduro through democratic institutions and elections, which I'd like to highlight, because this can be history repeated in other parts of the region in the near future, of really co-opting democracy and democratic institutions to start to create what Moises Naim terms the mafia state or the criminalized state. So through my academic focus has been on the illicit economy, we have to also see how this illicit economy and how Maduro has enabled external actors such as China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Lebanese Hezbollah to take advantage of this illicit economy that is totally based and thrives off of the trafficking of oil, gold, coltan, and drugs. What we've also seen is that it's created hemispheric security challenges. And the last panel, the illustrious panel, had highlighted the problem of the emigration and the diaspora coming out of the, whether it's political, socioeconomic, now health crisis that Venezuela has produced over 6 million migrants that is affecting the region as a whole. What is more disturbing is the fact that all of the measures, and I've spent 20 years on following the money, but more importantly, trying to design sanctions regimes across the globe to try to change behavior, right? We know that sanctions don't work alone and it has to work with other instruments of national power, such as diplomacy. But we've also seen the in flagrante attitude, not just of Maduro, but perhaps bringing it into that context of Russia, Ukraine, how sanctions have not had the desired effect. So Venezuela continues to be one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, but we've seen how astutely Maduro and his cohorts have been able to avoid these sanctions by creating these ties, whether they be political, diplomatic, economic, and more importantly, this anti-West, but even more so, they always look at the United States and they talk about their anti-imperialist posture to create this axis, anti-United States. That is what unites these external actors, and more importantly, how they take advantage of the Venezuelan illicit economy to gain access to oil and then also access to trading partners, which is why we see Iran and Turkey much more involved, not just in the petroleum sector, which I'm sure David's going to talk about, but also in terms of foodstuffs, et cetera, et cetera. What is very disturbing too is that we've seen how the insecurity in the criminal networks in Venezuela have tentacles way beyond the Venezuelan territory that have bled into what is happening in Colombia and far afield. So what we see are these illicit networks that are collaborating across the region with the assistance of whether it's Russian military advisory or equipment or Chinese investments, or in the case of Iran, technical expertise that they're exporting. The petroleum minister of Iran just recently visited Caracas as an outright example of how they're strengthening these ties and creating what you talked about, this alternative economy and this concept of de-Westernizing. Something I've been looking at is the digitalization of illicit networks, and we're seeing a lot of activity in cyberspace with the assistance of these external actors. I recently wrote about the risks that cryptocurrencies and more importantly, the Bitcoinization of El Salvador could represent as a way for countries such as Russia and Venezuela and Iran to start to engage in cyberspace in terms of sanctions evasion, as well as how to access dollars by trafficking in Bitcoin, but then going to places like El Salvador to convert that virtual currency into dollars. So this is something that we're really struggling with, is we've sanctioned them to the teeth, right? But the problem is it's not having the desired effects. And I think the case of Russia right now shows how many multilateral mechanisms of whether it's diplomatic isolation or economic and financial isolation is not having any impact. And some people are actually questioning now. As you all know, the international organizations such as the UN, the OAS, and NATO were formed in a post-World War II and a Cold War environment. And maybe they're not appropriate for what is the 21st century transnational threat theater. I'm going to leave it there because I know that my colleagues have tons to contribute. We could do an entire semester or a PhD on this topic, but I just wanted to kind of lay out my perspective and what I'm observing as the trends that are quite troubling with regard to Venezuela and its geopolitical context. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You were extraordinarily disciplined, and I think everybody will appreciate that. David, may I ask you to go next?
Sure, Eduardo, thanks so much. And thanks to FIU for the opportunity to join this panel in this incredible event. I think since my firm's experience is in the oil sector, and particularly given yesterday's news on a newly issued OFAC license, I'd like to focus my comments along those lines. When the Venezuelan government, including PDVSA, was listed by OFAC in January of 2019, crude production was impacted, and foreign investors in Venezuela's oil industry saw their profits put out of reach, essentially after having been disconnected from their projects. At the time, Venezuelan production had already fallen from 3 million barrels a day to about 1.4 million barrels a day, due largely to PDVSA's management inefficiencies, growing financial debt, as well as to key structural issues. I think particularly in the power sector, we saw power failures affecting production in a big way. Under President Trump, sanctions policy towards Venezuela was designed with what I believe to be sort of a singular scope, which was to push Maduro to resign so that free and fair elections could be held. As that has not happened 3 years later, there are those who think that sanctions should be strengthened to further isolate Maduro, and others who would like to consider policy adjustments as sanctions have come at a cost to the Venezuelan people. In my opinion, sanctions have not really been used as effective as they could be in terms of tools to affect change. There has been no realistic path towards delisting. Under the previous US administration, and certainly it's the view of some key players today, removing sanctions is a sign of weakness. This position has essentially backed Maduro into a corner, preventing rather than encouraging any change in behavior. There have been important unintended consequences of the US sanctions policy in Venezuela that I think should be considered as a new approach to devise a potentially new sanctions regime. And I think it's important because a lot of people are missing some of the minutia. So what are these consequences? I think first and probably most important to me is that sanctions policy has pushed Venezuelan crude exports to China. This year, Venezuela has exported over 600,000 barrels a day to China, either directly or via Singapore and Malaysia. Essentially, US sanctions are subsidizing China's oil imports. I think another important point, we've noted PDVSA discounts to China at anywhere from 19% to 66% since January of 2021. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of phantom traders profiting off of these crude trades, often transporting Venezuelan crude on unidentified tankers, with their satellite tracking services turned off. That is creating maritime and environmental risk that we think is unnecessary, or that there are ways to mitigate. Sanctions have opened the door for increased cooperation between Venezuela and Iran, the latter of which has supplied Venezuela with some 12 million barrels of condensate and 2 million barrels of crude, most recently in April, since July of last year. And this is all going to support PDVSA's production of extra heavy oil and PDVSA's refining operations. More than half of the crude that is produced in Venezuela is produced by Venezuela's joint ventures, the joint ventures I mentioned earlier. Over the last year, 3 international oil companies have exited their projects in Venezuela, primarily because their debt with PDVSA was accruing in an unmanageable way and to unmanageable levels. It's important, it's really important that qualified operators not leave the country. They offer the best hope that infrastructure will be maintained so that in the future, there will be a more solid industry in place to support economic redevelopment. Every day that passes, approximately 150 to 200,000 barrels a day of minority partner equity production. And we're not just talking Chevron, okay? Let's be clear about this. We're talking IOCs, we're talking NOCs like CNPC from China and the former assets of Rosneft currently in Russian hands are being essentially assumed. These exports are being assumed by PDVSA with no compensation to the partner. Essentially, this crude is going to finance the Maduro regime. But it's also going on the books as additional debt that will have to be paid back in the future. With an estimated 150 billion already in debt, certain aspects of the current sanctions policy are essentially mortgaging Venezuela's future. So I think I've used my 5 minutes. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk some about the repercussions of the environmental repercussions, gas flaring and venting, the necessity to pivot Venezuela towards its neighbors in the region. But I'll end it there.
Thank you, David. Let me now turn to Michael Penfold, who's I don't know if you're in Bogota or in Caracas, but it's great to see you again, Michael.
Eduardo, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share my views on Venezuela, sitting here in Caracas still, on how I see sort of this changing international context and its repercussions in Venezuela's sort of difficulty in finding a path forwards towards democratization and some kind of reinstitutionalization for the country to resume growth and address the tremendous social inequality and poverty that we're going through. I think there are 3 big changes going on worldwide and also regionally. One obviously has to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I think is changing the geopolitics worldwide. And obviously this is leading the US to look at the region. And obviously Venezuela stands up as an important country to deal with, given the influence of Russia, not only in the oil sector in Venezuela, but also in the military in the country. And Russia has also been playing a very important role financially to help, along with Turkey and China and Iran, to help the Maduro regime to bypass sanctions. So Russia has a very important role in that financial structure. And in fact, the current situation is one that, because Russia has been sanctioned, in particular its central bank and good, important numbers of banks in the financial sector, that has hurt the liquidity right now Chavismo, and it's limiting its ability at least to stabilize as they were the exchange rate in Venezuela, which has been flexibilized, but whereby they were intervening with a certain frequency to stabilize it. We've seen a major devaluation of the exchange rate, and I think that reflects in part that the central bank in Venezuela has no liquidity left, basically, but that liquidity that was abroad in Russia is now under difficult circumstances. Second change has to do with oil markets, right? And that's also making the U.S. Look into Venezuela again. I think it's looking at it not so much in the short term, but obviously in the medium and long term, given what I think is a crisis in Russia that is going to be long lasting. And obviously, the fact that Venezuela went out of the market in the U.S., in fact, was a position that Russia it took advantage of. And where, in fact, the displacement of Venezuela was a net positive development for Russia, by which they could increase their exports to the U.S. And this, I think, is also a situation, as David was mentioning, that is at least motivating some rethinking in Washington on how to address the Venezuelan situation. The third change that I think is also very significant is regional. I mean, we've seen a major political change in the region the last 2 years, with a very different kind of context that allowed the Trump administration, for example, to put together, with support of many different countries throughout the region, of what the maximum pressure strategy was, and as Selena has explained, which seems to have failed so far, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have any impact. It's just a question of how to use these different tools in a way that they can create the right incentives for the situation in Venezuela to move in a more positive development. So I think we're coming to terms with 3 different realities. One, Chavismo is not going to go away. This is forcing many to accept that this idea that the Chavismo was going to be dislodged by force from power is less likely. And therefore, that requires dealing with that reality in a different way, which is what I think is promoting the U.S. to be more supportive of some kind of negotiation as the one that is trying to be resumed as we speak in Mexico City between the Maduro regime and the opposition. Second reality in Venezuela is that the economy, even though we have experienced the worst collapse in economic terms in Latin America's modern history, I mean, we've lost over 2/3 of our economy in the context of a hyperinflationary process. The fact is that the regime has adapted, even without multilateral financial institutions supporting any kind of adjustment in the economy. And they have done this by promoting a de facto dollarization process, by removing and flexibilizing controls in the economy, and they have adapted in that way. So
Michael,
that's
can you begin to wind down, please?
Yeah. So I'll conclude with the third change, which is that both the regime and the opposition, in this context, have both become weaker, and that all these elements, all this international context that is changing, all this changes also in the domestic environment, with this weakening of both political actors in terms of popularity, I think will force both sides and the international community to come to terms with the fact that we're going to need some kind of real negotiation of some sort where the U.S. is truly involved in order to come to terms with this protracted and terrible political conflict in Venezuela. So I'll leave it there, Eduardo.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for the context. I gave you a little bit more time because I think it was important to get that Venezuelan context in. So let me now turn it over to Brian Fonseca. Brian?
Thanks, Professor. So I think agreeing with Selena right off the bat, this could be an entire semester-long, course on sort of the geopolitics. But I'll do my best. And now that I know that you're going to keep the time to the minute, I will try to at least put some comments out there that hopefully will be provocative and drive towards discussion later. I think that Michael's absolutely right in sort of stating that Venezuela has certainly found ways to weather the storm, despite still remaining in the midst of one of the worst economic contractions ever recorded, particularly among the largest in Latin America. But I think in part, and sort of expanding on what some of my colleagues have said, the Maduro dictatorship has continued to lean on a small group of states, both inside and outside of the region, to, I think, remain, seated in power. We've talked about China, Russia. I want to introduce Cuba. Certainly, Turkey and Iran have all played really important supporting roles for the regime, of course, to varying degrees. I think these countries have really helped Nicolas Maduro bypass U.S. sanctions, as Selena pointed out, to keep the Venezuelan economy muddling through and provide technical assistance to stave off internal and external threats. Last year, I testified before the U.S. Congress, and I argued that the considerations that were binding China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Venezuela together today were far less ideological. And instead, these countries are tied together largely by common authoritarian political structures and economic and political opportunism. Furthermore, I think these countries all share this antagonistic relationship with the United States, which also sort of brings them in sort of this same space in which they're traveling together. And so regime survival combined with our policy positions, for better or worse, encourage these authoritarian countries again to travel, I think, together. So one thing I'll point out is I still think it's important to note that these countries still overwhelmingly prioritize their own survival well above their relationship with Venezuela or amongst each other largely. And that leads me to conclude that the relationships are still very transactional and vulnerable to fracturing. I'm going to briefly highlight two relationships that I've done, a lot of work on over the last few years that I think illustrate the challenging geopolitical landscape in Venezuela, and that also pose serious threats to both champions of democratic governance across the region and more specifically American foreign policy. We talked, and I've heard it brought up, sort of the Russo-Venezuelan relationship. The relationship has evolved a great deal since Chavez and Putin forged ties during Chavez's two visits to Moscow in 2001. And I start at the beginning because I think it's really important, because there's a very clear line to sort of today. And so I want to highlight the sort of context of these relationships. But in the Russo-Venezuelan relationship, Putin saw tremendous economic and political opportunities in Venezuela, while Chavez sought to diversify Venezuela's foreign relations away from the United States. And in subsequent years, Russian companies like Rosneft, Gazprom, and others invested billions into Venezuela, largely focused in two areas: arms and energy deals. Chavez offered Russia political and military access on the ground in Venezuela and to the region as a whole. And in fact, much of the surge in Russian-Venezuelan engagement occurred during Maduro's tenure as Chavez's foreign minister between 2006 and 2013. After ascending to office in 2013, Maduro sought to leverage his relations with Russia and others to stave off challenges from internal political opposition, offset the massive amounts of money siphoned through widespread corruption, and to mitigate the economic death spiral that accelerated shortly after he took office. Today, that relationship is still largely opportunistic and is still largely built on both energy and arms in a very transactional manner. And in fact, I think to some degree, Russia undermines Venezuela but also needles the United States in a very serious way. One example is that Russia owns, roughly 1 billion barrels of P1 reserves in the ground, and has done, very little to actually lift it. And one might speculate, well, that's because keeping Venezuelan oil in the ground benefits Russian energy exports, which are pretty substantial. And so, again, that relationship is important. Hopefully we talk more about it. Also last year, I had an opportunity to co-author a detailed assessment on the Cuba-Venezuelan relationship with a brilliant scholar out of the U.S. Naval Academy, John Polga Hasimovich. We did it on behalf of the Wilson Center. Michael was also in that edition where he focused on China, but it was a fantastic study that looked at sort of Venezuela's authoritarian relations. In the case of Cuba, Venezuela, we found that, at sort of the outset of that relationship, Fidel Castro provided mentorship to Chavez in the areas of health, politics, security, and intelligence. And in return, Chavez helped underwrite Cuba at a time of economic hardship and diminishing relevance in the international system, particularly following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And although the texture of Cuban-Venezuelan relations remain consistent today with the areas, forged out of cooperation between Chavez and Castro, the intensity and depth of engagement slowly faded under Presidents Raul Castro and subsequently Miguel Diaz-Canel in Cuba and Maduro in Venezuela, with a notable exception of one area, and that's Cuban security and intelligence support to Venezuelan leadership. Today, it appears that Cuba security officials exercise influence in Venezuela and have helped maintain the Maduro government in power. Details of those relationships, again, remain shrouded in secrecy for obvious reasons, and it complicates any real assessment of Cuba's role. But the Venezuelan and Cuban governments have not been transparent about the size and scope of any contingent of Cuban military and security professionals operating in Venezuela. And so despite the lack of transparency and the often exaggerations regarding Cuban security professionals, it is evident that Cuba has supported providing security training and technical assistance, and has aided in very difficult times Venezuela's ability to firewall itself from internal and external threats. And so I wanted to briefly talk about those two. Certainly we can talk more about the China relationship, which is even deeper and I think more expansive. And of course, more of them may be tactical, opportunistic relationships with Turkey and Iran, but they all sort of forge, as I stated at the onset, sort of this group of authoritarian countries that sort of travel together.
Ryan, can you wind down, please?
Yeah, that was my last statement, that they all sort of form this group of countries that are traveling together for the reasons I stated at the onset. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. And that was, I think, really a very, very nice overview of what I think will be a much more detailed discussion. And so now I think each of you will have an opportunity to really drill down on some of the issues you've raised. So let me begin with a very broad question, and perhaps Selena, you can tackle this one, but others can jump in, of course. You of course have talked a lot about the convergence of geopolitics, but tell us a little bit about how this works in terms of the military, economically. How does this affect international relations? Does it have any impact on the cultural aspects, et cetera? So tell us a little bit about how Venezuela exemplifies this convergence.
Take a look at the axis. So we just call it the anti-American axis, the anti-US axis. They're not what we would call likely partners, right? We just take a look culturally at Iran, Russia, China, and Venezuela. But what do they have in common? They're autocratic states, as my colleagues have all alluded to. And what are they? They're actually anti-democratic states. And this is why I started my remarks talking about this has been the battleground for several years, well beyond the more recent discussion of autocracy versus democracy that will be highlighted in the Biden's administration's new national security strategy when it's published. It's been going on for years, if not decades. It's also perhaps a different manifestation of what we had known historically as a Cold War, but it's in different foray, right? So we're seeing much more ties economically. And because all of them are in the same position of being economically, financially, and diplomatically isolated, they've had to become friendships of utility, right? And then the other thing that we've seen with the case of Venezuela, they have been extremely fortunate that in terms of gold and oil prices, they have been on the rise because of the pandemic. And then more importantly, the more recent conflict, and I'm going to call it, it's the invasion of Ukraine, has destabilized, as David knows quite well, global energy markets. So in a weird way, Venezuela has gotten stronger in terms of economically, whether we talk about the physical and more importantly, the political stance that the Maduro regime has, that's a different question, right? And what we've seen is they've found ways, because they're all in the same boat, of trying to evade sanctions and yet continue to access dollars. And this is where cyberspace is becoming a much more keen area. We've heard about the crypto mining taking place in Venezuela, creating power outages. It's happening all over the world. People who are mining cryptocurrencies, whether they be Bitcoin or others, are looking for places that are quite permissive and have tremendous access to cheap energy. And Venezuela had, even before the pandemic, been one of these places. What's disturbing for those of us who do follow the illicit financial flows is the anonymous nature of cryptocurrencies means that you can load into cyberspace, right, the value of Bitcoin, and then more importantly, withdraw it in a fiat currency such as the US dollar. Obviously, the last 2 weeks, we've seen tremendous volatility in stablecoin and cryptocurrencies, but that's still access to fiat currencies that these regimes now, because of the sanctions regimes against all of, we call the VRIC, right? The Venezuela, Russia, Iran, China. They see actually this friendship of utility being actually now existential to help them maintain. And we have always been taught, as you all know, when we were studying international relations, of the natural resource curse. It's actually now a blessing when it comes to oil and the global energy markets because of what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. This is why when we look at things that are taking place far away from the Americas, they have huge security, defense, and economic implications. We haven't even talked, I think the last panel started to talk about the food insecurity that's going to result from the disturbances in the global supply of wheat because of the Russia, Ukraine, and fertilizer because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But we see the Maduro regime is very creative in the way they exploit. And if anything, what they all share, I call it the party of opportunism, right? In terms of whether they're actually wed to communism or socialism or whatever the ideology that we like to prescribe to them. What they have done is create this axis anti-the US, always portraying us as the enemy. But more importantly, they've been quite effective in being pretty in flagrante against the global sanctions regime. And that's why I think you see people starting to revisit the sanctions, imposition of sanctions, and then perhaps the easing of sanctions as a foreign policy tool to try to change the situation. So just to kind of get our conversation started, all eyes are on Russia, Ukraine, but it has tremendous impact throughout the world in places that perhaps have not been studied.
Great, thank you, Selena. David, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, a lot's been said already, right? And I think I would take sort of a pragmatic position in terms of the roles of Russia and China, particularly in the Venezuelan oil industry. I see them as being more commercial. I think that absolutely the Russians want to sort of stick their finger in the eye of the United States with their presence in Venezuela, but they haven't had much luck in the oil industry. Right now, their Petromanagas project is producing about 57,000 barrels a day. It should be at 120. It's been down, and it experiences the same exact problems as other joint ventures in the country with less favorable political or bilateral relations with Venezuela. CNPC, the Chinese, the same exact thing. Both the Russians and the Chinese in the oil industry have really played a long-term game with their investment. Yes, they've got, as Brian mentioned, strong reserves. That's critical for them. And so they don't want to lose those. And I think that they are continuing to look at the potential down the road for an opposition government or an alternative to the Maduro administration to take power. And therefore, they're not violating current legislation. They're really sticking in line with current legislation. They've also really coalesced or been concerned about compliance with US sanctions. And they did that quite immediately. We do see the exports going to China, to the Chinese independents. Another point here is that the Chinese NOCs stopped importing Venezuelan crude due to concern with sanctions. Chinese banks also refusing to finance Venezuelan oil trades out of concern for sanctions. So, you know, one of the things that we've been thinking is, if the US does successfully revamp its sanctions policy and gives the oil sector licenses to begin to operate again, to start lifting production, it wouldn't be unreasonable. I think the Russian situation is different now following the invasion of Ukraine, but it wouldn't be unreasonable, I think, to offer CNPC a license right off the bat. It's been commercially oriented, and the production would probably end up going to the United States. Again, keeping the energy in this hemisphere. So I think that's maybe something that's important to entertain. The revamping of sanctions, given the key Russian and China production in the country, is a little bit complex, right? Because how do you allow companies like Chevron and Repsol, Eni, and others to begin to be more operational and avoid the same thing happening with the Russian companies and the Chinese companies? So I think there are definitely challenges there. One of the things that I want to mention, though, is that in the US, you know, I think that when we're talking about dysfunctional politics, we can include the US. And here, what we see is some very real opposition towards any flexibility of sanctions whatsoever. And I think that there is a real concern, particularly with the oil for debt proposals that are sort of circulating, or at least being initially discussed, that they will automatically mean money into the pockets of the Maduro regime. And I'd just like to mention that we have examined, we've looked at oil industry recovery plans. We've produced some of our own. We have also assessed some of the strategies for oil for debt programs. And it is absolutely possible to structure these, you know, with the premise that no money will go into the Maduro coffers. And at the same time, we can see down the road that the way these are structured could actually be one of those now somewhat cliche, but I guess very accurately termed carrots for the Maduro regime, or, you know, assuming that there is international acceptation of the 2024 elections and he wins, or not, there is a real financial benefit there if we do this right going forward. And I think that the sustainability of whatever the situation is after the 2024 elections is something that we really want to focus on.
Okay, let me try to move this forward a little bit. I think we pretty much now know what convergence means of geopolitics, but let me go a little bit further and ask you, and maybe we can start with Michael and then Brian. What are China, Russia, Iran, and to a certain extent Cuba seeking from this relationship with Venezuela, from expanding in Venezuela or even inserting themselves in Venezuela? You've addressed this a little bit, but in the context of this new convergence era. Let's start with Michael.
Well, I think they're driven by different interests, right? I mean, China demands oil, Russia produces oil, so they have different interests. So China really wants access to Venezuela's oil in commercial terms, so that's the main interest of China. And Cuba, I think, shares that interest. They want access to Venezuela's oil at basically no price as a subsidy. So that holds that's a very important difference. I also think that they have different visions or risk, how risk adverse they can be towards Venezuela. For example, I agree with David that China, for example, entered into Venezuela as their entry point to the rest of Latin America. They were heavily invested and they provided loans for over $50 billion in Venezuela. But today, those investments and those loans outside of Venezuela are larger now for China than in Venezuela. So China cares more about its reputation in the rest of Latin America than in Venezuela. But that doesn't mean that they're willing to abandon Venezuela. And in fact, they also care about secondary sanctions, as David was saying. So China, for example, will not violate secondary sanctions. And in fact, they've been very strict about this. And in fact, most of that risk has been delegated to other nations, in particularly Iran, who is dealing with that risk by shipping diluents and diesel to Venezuela, for example. And when you look at Russia, I think Russia has a geopolitical interest in Venezuela more than anything else, and Venezuela is a great platform for them to have and to exercise some kind of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Beyond their area of influence, and this they've done through different mechanisms. They've done this through financing, not only to the military, but to purchase arms, but also to the oil sector. But also, like China, Russia has been very adverse to secondary sanctions. And in fact, Rosneft left Venezuela basically because it's a global company that it's publicly listed, and therefore they could not cope with the kind of risks associated to secondary sanctions in Venezuela. So this leads me to a broader point, which is, yes, it is true that these authoritarian countries, or this coalition, global coalition, or this global ecosystem, which is becoming larger and larger, by the way, is important. But that doesn't mean that Venezuela or the Maduro regime doesn't care about reinserting itself again in the world. And particularly, that's important for an oil economy like ours. And this, I think, is part of what's driving their interests in resuming negotiations, particularly after seeing that the U.S. was not only willing to sort of revise its policy sanctions, but also to engage directly with the regime in a visit that was very polemical in the U.S., that experienced a tremendous pushback from different actors, but that at the same time it was a very interesting political experiment, because that visit, seen from the Venezuela point of view, was very important. There was a meeting, there was some diplomatic engagement, there were talk about what that quid pro quo could be to lead to a more meaningful negotiation, and that involved some kind of sanction relief, but it's a sanction relief that is going to be contingent upon major concessions. So again, thinking about sanctions without thinking about diplomacy, or about thinking about engagement, because this idea that you're gonna exercise sanctions without engaging diplomatically, I think it's a very problematic proposition, because at the end you need both. You need to operate with both tools, and obviously under one vision of how you use these tools, diplomacy plays less of a role, and sanctions places more of a pressure for regime change. But I think, for example, the fact that now in the memo of understanding in the Mexico negotiation process, the memo is very clear. It's not talking about regime change. It's talking about democratic coexistence. That is about reinstitutionalizing the country. And that's going to require from the US a different kind of diplomatic engagement, which is something that I believe they're trying to do. The White House is trying to do, but it's doing it, with a lot of difficulties, because it's also experiencing a lot of pushback from different actors, particularly in the Hill. I can't hear you, Eduardo. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you. We're going to go back to the U.S. in just a moment, but thank you for introducing that part of the discussion. Brian, let's go back to the question about the extra hemispheric actors.
Yeah, I want to add a few things. I mean, I agree with everything that Mike said about sort of the diversity of interests across all of these actors. I'll tell you that there, one, interest in the plural, right? I think that there is a common interest that these countries share, and that is largely the preservation of some, if not all, of their respective preferred political models, right? Largely authoritarian. I think that is an element that kind of, again, as I insisted earlier, sort of brings them together and kind of moves them along together as they navigate sort of the global landscape. But you can't stop there. I think, to Michael's point, each of these countries have, sort of at times diverging interests, right? When you think about Venezuela and Russia, Iran, these are all important competitors in the global, energy market. And so, there's some divergence in their respective interests over competition for the access to markets to export. Some in our audience might be surprised to learn that, despite the adversarial relationship that the United States has with Russia, Russia is one of the largest energy providers to the United States, despite the fact that we, again, have sidelined, Venezuela. I know we're going to talk about U.S. policy in a few minutes, and I look forward to that, and I have some thoughts on that too. But there are interests that bind these countries. There are interests that sort of separate these countries, and in some cases, create divergence among these countries and their respective interests. There's no doubt that there are economic interests, and Michael shared some of them. The broader geopolitical interest, I think, is interesting, right? Under Chavez, Venezuela sort of asserted itself as an activist, an activist political power in the hemisphere. It lost some of that with the departure of Chavez and sort of the rise of Maduro, and he struggled to really build some, activist consolidated, front in the Americas, and he struggled, I think, deeply to try to bring the region, sort of towards his particular political, model preference. You look at Russia. Russia definitely has both an economic, even though, as David pointed out, the Russians have suffered hard in Venezuela with respect to their energy interests. In fact, several, memos published by Rosneft concluded that they were losing heavily in terms of their investments in Venezuela. But Russia still, looked at Venezuela as an opportunity to exert some geopolitical, influence, particularly in the face of U.S. overtures in Eurasia and sort of the Russia periphery. And so, Russia's got sort of its interest both in the economic and the geopolitical space, and that's the same for China, right? China is a global power. Is in search of continuing to build its portfolio of allies and partners around the world to rival or compete with the United States' influence in the global system. They're certainly interested in a future political, orientation that is less democratic as we define it and more autocratic as they, sort of exhibit it. And so creating those allies around the world is part of, I think, a broader approach to, to sort of normalize the Chinese political model in the international system. And so looking for allies, looking for countries that it considers more closely aligned with its views, I think is in its geopolitical interests. But there are also economic interests there, despite the fact that just like Russia, China's had to follow up its investments in Venezuela just to try to recover its initial investments, right? I mean, China is one of the largest investors in Venezuela. It's had to sink more money just to try to get its initial investment back, which it still hasn't cleared. And so the economic interests are there, but again, we see the geopolitical interests. And I think that is, again, sort of this idea that there are multiple interests, they're distinct among countries, but they all have something that they share. And that is, as Selena pointed out, and I think others, sort of the being adversarial, being an adversarial rival of the West and the preferences for survival of their respective political models.
Thank you, Brian. Let me turn now to really a question of costs more than anything else. I mean, in a sense, I think it would be very interesting to get your opinions on, what have been the real costs and the real benefits to the Maduro regime from this, let's call it de-Westernization of Venezuela's economy. What are the real consequences there? And let me tag on to that a second question, which is also thinking about it in terms of costs. What are and Michael, you sort of went in this direction already. What are the consequences? What are the implications for the United States and for the region, right? Should there be any real concern about what's happening in Venezuela with this entire process? Selena, you want to tackle that first?
Sure. So if we just take a look at in basic economics, everyone's already alluded to the utter collapse, right, of the Venezuelan internal economy and its role globally. And this has also, sadly, been a major contributor to the exodus, right, the diaspora of Venezuelans out of desperation that has directly affected not just Colombia, which is housing and has welcomed. And kudos to Colombia for being open-minded enough to try to integrate now the Venezuelans with actual legal papers to be able to work in Colombia. But it's had these episodes that are much further than that. We've also seen, sadly, in Colombia, and I've been there 3 times in 3 months, the rise of Venezuelan armed gangs that are now wreaking havoc on citizen security in Colombia. So all of these things that happen in Venezuela have impacts well beyond the sovereignty of Venezuela. In terms of actual costs, when you see crisis, it actually spurs creativity. And I have to give the Maduro regime credit for being able to maneuver, right, and actually be very resilient in the face of sanctions, and also capitalizing on the rising oil prices, as well as gold. We didn't really talk that much about the illicit gold trade that has huge environmental impact in Orinoco and well beyond. And also the presence of the FARC dissidents and the ELN that are contributing to this illicit economy, whether it's gold, coltan, or narco trafficking. We haven't mentioned it, but we're now anticipating, since demand for cocaine is on the rise in Europe, and the price of a kilo of Colombian cocaine is about double that in the United States, we see that Venezuela is going to be increasingly stepping up its role in global drug trafficking, particularly in cocaine, which is another way that the regime is enriching themselves. Every time you see a cost, people look at crisis as an opportunity. And as I mentioned before, they're all opportunists when we talk about the VRIC. And in terms of the cost to us in the West, whether it's our partners in the hemisphere or beyond, who have, in solidarity with Juan Guaido, the interim president of Venezuela, have tried through so many different avenues to restore the talks and the movement towards free and fair elections. We're seeing now that the status quo cannot continue, right? So we have to take a look at how to take advantage and capitalize on the costs, or more importantly, the pain that the Maduro regime is feeling, and try to find new avenues for them to come back to the negotiating table in order to bring about free and fair elections. So it's very complex. And also the way that the Venezuelan economy is structured is not a classic economy. You spoke a little bit about the de-Westernization of the economy. The illicit economy is what props up the Maduro regime. And sadly, because of geopolitical factors and global commodities pricing, they're actually faring fairly well, to the dismay of many of us who have been following Venezuela for about 20 years, and also the economic measures. And to support what Michael was saying, we always think about the instruments of national power, whether they be military, diplomatic, information, or economic. They have to work in concert with each other. And so the question then is, what will move the needle and bring the Maduro regime back to the table that would be acceptable to the opposition in order to actually celebrate and realize free and fair elections? And that's the multi-billion-dollar question that faces all of us who follow this issue quite closely.
Thank you, Selena. I think, Michael, you have your hand up. Is that correct, or were you just?
No, I'm just, no hands up.
Okay, great. Who would like to go next on this issue? David?
Well, no, I think Selena pretty much answered everything. Maybe just to look at this from a practical perspective, when we've seen the interest, I think that what was it, $1 billion question, Selena, or $1 million question? I think the $1 billion question. What will move the needle? I think it's going to be money. Maduro right now seems to be running out of cash. Clearly, to me, an impact of potentially embargoed funds in Russian banks. They're going to need to shift their cash flow. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez mentioned, she stated that the cost of sort of the financial transactions moving that oil revenue back to Venezuela is 15% of the sale of that oil. So you tack that on top of these crude discounts, and you have a really serious economic impact. We've seen people in PDVSA saying, wow, you know what, we would love to trade with the United States again. We wouldn't have to go out, for these deep discounts. We would be able to generate some revenue. Chavez was so interested in developing this sort of multipolar position, moving away from the United States. And I think that his timing was amazing, because when US sanctions hit, he was already channeling a whole bunch of his crude to China, and that helped at the time. But I think the secret here is diversification. And now Venezuela is not diversified at all. And when you work with these sort of rogue nations that all have their own challenges and that are also competing with you on the energy front, you really run into some issues from time to time. It's a very cyclical, opportunistic cycle that you're going through. And I think that that's where Maduro is right now. He's having a really difficult time. And that, moving the needle could be creativity on the part of the US. I've been reading some of the questions, and I don't want to jump on them, obviously, because Eduardo, you're moderating, but there is a general concern about treating Maduro as the real or sort of legitimate leader of the country. And I think we need to look at who has territorial control at this point in time and address him as the person with territorial control. And that means, as Brian mentioned, as Michael and Selena, I think we're all on the same page that engagement needs to happen. And at some point in time, some normalization of economic activity should follow.
Okay, thank you. We have, I have a couple of more questions, but we also have 17 questions in the queue. So we've obviously piqued some interest here. So Michael and Brian, could I ask you very briefly to address this issue, if there's more to be said, right? Michael?
No, I'll pass it to Brian. Although, I mean, my biggest concern really right now is that the region is changing. I mean, it's changing in Mexico. It's going to change. You know, even if Fico wins in Colombia, it's not going to be exactly the same situation. You know, we're having elections coming up in Brazil. You know, big elections already took place in Chile and Peru. So you have a real challenge for the U.S. because it's a changing environment, and in that changing environment, the Venezuelan situation is a real challenge. So for me, it's not only about sanction policy; it's about engagement in a region where multilateral institutions are not working that well either, right? And this adds even further. So, for example, you know, let's go back to this visit for the White House to Caracas. No one knows exactly what happened, but there was an important conversation that took place there. It seems to me that it was a quid pro quo, so kind of conversation. But the reality is that, you know, the White House had to go back and it had to deliver on something. And the reality in the Hill and the reality also with the Venezuelan opposition is one where most likely they had to water down whatever was on the table. And it seems to me, beyond, you know, any value proposition, that the fact is that the kind of leverage that the US and even the opposition have today is much less than what they had 3 years ago. So, you know, it's going to be very difficult to implement sanction relief. One, if you're not convinced that this is the right policy, and how you're going to do it, because you can't promise if you have not negotiated prior with all the different actors, whatever you're going to offer. And you need to coordinate different actors, not only within the opposition, but also within the region. So this is going to require massive skills to deal with, and a more astute diplomacy on behalf of the US. And this is my sort of biggest take, because without that, I mean, we have an important announcement that was made yesterday. It took months to deliver. It seems that there is an opening to resume talks in Mexico. But you know, without these kind of changes and just waiting to see if the regime is going to make the concession or not, based on sanctions exclusively, I think it's a very difficult proposition because, and I'll conclude here, there's one thing we've learned, and that all of these countries we've been talking about have already learned. The best antidote, el antídoto, against sanctions is to resist in power, because at the end, the U.S., most of these countries learn is that the U.S. loses focus, right? It hits hard, but it loses focus. So you have just to hang in there, okay, and wait for external conditions to change. And this is a reality now in Venezuela. Those conditions have changed.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to segue to Brian, because in a sense, the geopolitical conditions changed perhaps in February, right? And so given this new convergence that we've been talking about, Brian, and given the announcement yesterday to a certain extent, what should we tell the Biden administration regarding policy toward Venezuela?
So, I mean, you sort of point to February, and I think perhaps there was, sort of the shift in what we're seeing, not just in Venezuela, but earlier this week, the announcement towards, making some provisions to U.S. policy towards Cuba. I think those things were months in the coming. I think that they certainly predated, the actual February 24th further, sort of invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I think it was part of maybe the administration's thinking in terms of how, and we heard this from Juan Gonzalez yesterday, how to sort of shift U.S. policy in sort of tectonic form. How do we make sort of bold shifts in American policy? And so I suspect that the announcements may be expedited or seemingly on the backs of the February 21st further incursion, but also perhaps ahead of the Summit of the Americas, also to sort of take, those things off the table as part of discussions around the summit. But I still think there's no doubt. I think Michael summed it up, incredibly well. I'll add to what Michael said and just sort of suggesting the following is that I still believe strongly that there's a preference for engaging with the United States, and that largely Venezuelan engagement with China, Russia, Turkey, Iran, has been more of a product of our isolation than their genuine sort of interest in sort of engaging those particular countries. So I think that there's still a seeming, interest in preference for engaging and doing business with the United States, but survival preempts that interest, which is what's led them, across the Atlantic, to engage other countries, right? And so I still think that the United States has an opportunity to capitalize on the fact that it is the preference. What Michael said is really important in that, and he said it earlier, which is Venezuela has figured out how to weather the storm. They're managing to sort of get by, and so that kind of helps alleviate some of the immediacy of or desperation. But the fact that I think they're willing to come back to the table is something that the United States has to capitalize on. But again, the United States has to be very clear in terms of what its expectations are at the table. I'll tell you the one thing that isolation has led to, and perhaps my colleagues agree or disagree, but it's also taken a lot of America's non-state influence out of Venezuela, right? The fact that the private sector is no longer active on the ground, I think doesn't bode well for our, the ability to sort of exercise our influence on the ground. The sort of people-to-people contacts have been diminishing, particularly as people flee Venezuela and families set up roots here. I think that's diminished some of the people-to-people contacts, or at least the familial contacts going back and forth, where there's an opportunity there to deepen those if we provide the right provisions to open access. So I think that there's a lot that could be done strategically to get us back on the ground in Venezuela and sort of charging towards the reinstitutionalization of democratic norms and governance. And having the regime back at the table, I think, is an important step in getting there. But again, there's got to be reciprocation, on both sides if this is going to truly go forward. But I'll tell you what you are seeing clearly that you didn't see maybe 3 years ago, and that is the opposition seemingly is asking for this too, right? The opposition and members that have been diametrically on the opposite of the Maduro regime are also asking the United States to consider getting back to the table, because they're also looking for opportunity to coexist in Venezuela. So I think those are important comments I just add to the question, Eduardo.
Thank you very much, Brian. Just sort of building on that, but then again, a question to everybody before we go into the numerous questions that are in the chat. And I want to ask this because it really is in the back of everybody's mind, right? Venezuela has not been invited to the summit, and there yesterday in the discussions there was sort of an intriguing moment in which it appeared as if maybe the invitations haven't yet been issued. And that given this new scenario, that invitations could go out, and that that maybe the opposition and the regime would both be invited. What should be discussed at the Summit of the Americas vis-a-vis Venezuela? Selena, you want to go first?
Well, just a reminder in terms of the summit that's trying to be inclusive, there's huge debate, right, in terms of who should or shouldn't be invited to the Summit of the Americas. Well, not everybody was invited to the Summit for Democracy, which Guatemalan President John Matei has reminded us, who has also just said he will not be attending the Summit of the Americas. Whether he got the invitation or not, we don't know. And also Bolsonaro, right? And then I think this calls into question much more fundamental kind of issue of if these multilateral, these photo ops, what's the actual objective, right? So we saw, just because we've been looking at it so closely the last couple of weeks, the UN, the NATO alliance, right? We've actually failed in terms of dissuading Putin and creating these grand defensive alliance. So if you take that in terms of his invasion of Ukraine, and all of these different diplomatic, economic, financial measures that have been taken to try to punish him haven't actually worked. When we look at the Summit of the Americas, obviously we as a community, right, share this, I guess, aspiration for free and fair democracies through free and fair elections. And if we use that as the paradigm or the framework, right, Venezuela under Maduro does not qualify. And he's not the only one that we're questioning. We also have Cuba and Nicaragua, and I'm quite disturbed to see the authoritarian tendencies that are taking place in El Salvador. And the bigger question is, what is the objective of the Summit of the Americas? We're only 3 weeks away, and I've worked many years in government and have staffed many of these summits. Normally by now we've worked out kind of what the deliverables are, which is a very Washington concept, and we're not there. So the bigger question then is, what is the objective? And then if we have this objective of reinforcing democracy, fighting things like corruption, transnational threats like crime, and I think mass migration and the irregular migration, it affects every one of the countries that will be represented at the Summit of the Americas. We have to have more clarity. And it's quite obvious that Venezuela under Maduro is not cooperating under international norms that promote democracy, freedom, and the respect for human rights. But I'll leave my other colleagues to comment as well. But it'll be very interesting. 3 weeks of drama, a lot of action on Twitter, and everyone has their opinion about who should or shouldn't be invited to the party in Los Angeles.
You should be in Miami for a couple of radio hours.
Yes.
In any event, let me then ask each of you for a very, very brief final statement. David, start with you.
No, I think there's not much additionally to add to this great conversation. Your speakers have been quite eloquent, so I think I'll pass in the sake of time.
Thank you very much for participating, David. Michael?
Well, just very briefly, I think we're in a very interesting critical juncture right now in Venezuela. If talks are in fact resumed in Mexico City, but it's going to require massive work, massive diplomatic work in the region, from the US, from Europe and the US. And it's gonna require a rethinking and in a different way on how to tackle the current situation, which I think has been very well described, but that it's gonna require, a different kind of approach.
Thank you again, Michael, for participating. Great to see you. And Brian, you have the last word.
That's a lot of pressure, especially with President Solis looking at me on screen, like, hurry up. No, I think a lot has been said here. I'm going to do my best to try to answer some questions in the chat and encourage the other speakers, if they see a question they can tackle quickly, to type it in the chat. I've replied to a few. There were a few questions about sort of whether or not we truly understand sort of what led to the rise of Chavez, and then of course the transition of Maduro. And I think that's been well studied. And again, it's sometimes hard to forget that Chavez came in, or hard to remember that Chavez came in with incredible support from Venezuelans, largely looking at a break, from sort of the what was going on in the country in sort of the decades leading up to that, particularly among certain elements of society. And the handoff to Maduro was really about continuity, more so than change, of course. Our colleague Vladimir Ravinsky asked a question about, if Petro wins the election in Colombia, what happens? And probably Vladimir is the best person to answer this because he's, a renowned scholar in Colombia. But I'll certainly add, my sense that I think that, the United States has an incredibly strong relationship with Colombia. I don't see Russia or China displacing that. I think it might increase competition for the United States to be a preferred partner of Colombia. And the United States will have to work extra hard to maintain its influence in Colombia, because there will be some opening to China and Russia likely. And it depends largely on how the United States responds if Petro is in fact elected. But I know Vladimir knows the answer to that question. And then there were several questions on sort of democratization and how to recover democracy. And I think Michael made some questions about that. That's going to be very difficult. And I guess the last thing I'll point out is it's not going to occur overnight. Right, the reinstitutionalizing or reestablishing, true democratic rules of the game are going to take a little bit of time to sort of recover. You're talking about institutions that have been purged now over the course of decades, and that all has to be, sort of undone and sort of reinstitutionalized. And that's not going to be something that happens just because Maduro is ousted from power. Right, there's going to be serious structural changes to institutions, I think, have to occur. And I saw several questions on that. So I will end there.
Thank you, Brian. And I want to thank all of the participants. And I want to thank President Solis. He does come from a democratic country, so I wasn't as worried as Brian. But I want to thank you both for the opportunity to moderate this wonderful panel. I learned a lot, and I know the audience did as well. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Gamarra. Absolutely. It was a very, very interesting panel, and the experience of all our distinguished guests showed. So I thank you very much for a great moderation, and I would like to invite everybody to join us tomorrow. We have the third day of this exciting Hemispheric Security Conference. And tomorrow we'll have a keynote address by Ricardo Zúñiga, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of Western Hemisphere Affairs and Special Envoy to the Northern Triangle. A great panel on the re-examination of the 2003 Declaration on Security in the Americas, and a panel discussion on disinformation, democracy, and the inter-American system. So as you see, we continue with great topics. Thank you all for having joined us. And from FIU in Miami, it is my pleasure to bid you farewell until tomorrow. Please join us. Begin tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp. It's been my pleasure to be your MC for this day. Be well.